The Emperor's ship arrived precisely on schedule, despite the growing chaos aboard the station. Yuki watched through the main viewer as the massive vessel approached the docking bay, its hull gleaming with the silver and gold markings of the Imperial fleet. "Status report," she demanded, though she already knew the answer would be bad. "Power fluctuations are now affecting 60% of the station," Nari reported, his voice strained with exhaustion. "Communication array is experiencing random interference. 3 of our docked ships have switched to emergency power, and the artificial gravity in sections 9 through 12 is fluctuating between 80 and 120% of normal. Can you at least stabilize the docking bay for the Emperor's arrival?" "I'm trying, but every time I fix one system, 2 others develop problems. It's like the station is fighting us." Yuki felt sweat on her forehead despite the cool air in the command center. The Emperor was known for his intolerance of failure. If he saw the station in its current condition, there would be consequences that went far beyond simple embarrassment. "Bring up Jin again," she ordered. Maybe he can suggest something else. But when the guards brought Jin to the command center, he took one look at the status displays and shook his head grimly. "It's too late," he said. "You've triggered a complete cascade failure. The only way to stop it now is to shut down the entire station and restart everything from scratch." "How long would that take?" 12 hours minimum. Maybe more if we find additional problems during the restart sequence." Yuki felt her heart sink. The Emperor was already docking. She had maybe 10 minutes before he would expect a full tour of the captured station. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. Jin pretended to think about it. "Well, there might be one option, but it would require finding whoever is sabotaging your repair efforts." "Sabotage?" Nari looked up from his console in shock. "These are equipment malfunctions, not sabotage." "Look at the pattern," Jin said, calling up a timeline display. "Every problem started small and grew worse when you tried to fix it. Every solution you implemented made the overall situation more unstable. That's not random equipment failure. That's intelligent interference." Yuki studied the timeline. Jin was right. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. Who could be doing this? Someone who understands this station better than your engineers do. Someone who knows how all the systems connect to each other. Someone who's been moving freely through areas you haven't bothered to secure. "The agricultural section," Yuki said suddenly. "All the power anomalies started there." She turned to her communications officer. "Send security teams to sweep the farming areas. Find whoever is hiding down there." But even as she gave the order, new alarms began sounding throughout the command center. The docking clamps holding the Emperor's ship had begun fluctuating. The massive vessel was being gently shaken as power surged through the station's systems. "Compensate immediately," Yuki ordered. "I'm trying," Nari said, his hands flying over the controls. "But the docking bay power grid is connected to the main reactor through 17 different pathways. I can't isolate it without shutting down half the station." Through the main viewer, they could see lights flickering aboard the Emperor's ship as power fluctuations fed back through the docking umbilicals. It was exactly the kind of technical failure that would suggest the Velkari couldn't even safely capture a primitive human station. Deep in the agricultural section, Day was putting the finishing touches on his masterpiece. He had spent the last hour creating his final modification, a connection so subtle and so deeply buried in the station's infrastructure that no one would find it unless they knew exactly where to look. This modification linked the station's waste processing system to the communication array in a way that would create electromagnetic interference whenever organic waste was processed. Since the aliens had been eating human food for the past day, there was quite a lot of organic waste being processed. The interference would disrupt not just the station's communications, but also the navigation systems of any ship docked to the station, including the Emperor's vessel. Day finished the last connection and carefully closed the access panel. His grandfather's wrench felt warm in his hand, as if the old tool understood the importance of this moment. He made his way to a maintenance tunnel that led toward the main corridors. It was time to end this charade. Above him, Yuki was receiving reports from the security team searching the agricultural areas. "We found evidence of recent activity in several sections," the team leader reported. "Someone has been working on multiple systems. The modifications are crude but effective. Any sign of the saboteur?" "Not yet, but we're still searching." Yuki was about to respond when a new voice cut across the command center communications. "This is Emperor Vax. I am experiencing technical difficulties with my ship's systems. Explain this immediately. Yuki felt her blood turn cold. The Emperor's voice carried the kind of authority that could order the execution of entire worlds. And he was clearly not pleased. Your Majesty, she said carefully. We are experiencing minor technical issues with the station's power grid. Our engineers are working to resolve them. Minor issues? My navigation systems are reporting that this station is moving in 6 different directions simultaneously. My communication array is receiving signals that appear to be waste management data, and my docking clamps are shaking my ship like a child's toy. We will have it fixed immediately, Your Majesty. You will indeed. I expect a full explanation within 1 hour. The communication ended, leaving the command center in stunned silence. An hour to solve problems that had been growing worse for the entire day. Find that saboteur, Yuki ordered. Now. But before anyone could respond, a new voice spoke from the entrance to the command center. You don't need to find me. I'm right here. Everyone turned to see a human man standing in the doorway. He was wearing dirty coveralls and carrying an old metal wrench. His hands were stained with grease and his hair was dusty from crawling through maintenance tunnels. Day, Jin said with satisfaction. Hello, Jin. Sorry I'm late. I had some plumbing to finish. Yuki gestured to her guards, who immediately raised their weapons. But Day didn't seem concerned. He walked calmly into the command center, looking around at the flashing alarm lights and panicked alien engineers with obvious satisfaction. So, he said conversationally, you're having some technical difficulties. You did this, Yuki accused. You sabotaged our systems. I fixed your systems, Day corrected. Your people were trying to use our station without understanding how it works. That's dangerous. Someone could get hurt. Undo it now. Day looked at the status displays showing chaos throughout the station. Power fluctuations, communication interference, gravity anomalies, and a very angry Emperor whose ship was being shaken by malfunctioning docking clamps. I could fix all of this, he said thoughtfully. It would take about 10 minutes with the right tools. He held up his grandfather's wrench. But I don't think I will. You will fix it or you will die, Yuki said coldly. Maybe, but your Emperor will still be stuck on a station that doesn't work, and your fleet will still be trapped in docking bays with unstable power connections, and your engineers will still be trying to understand systems that were built by people who think differently than you do. Day walked over to Nari's console and looked at the diagnostic displays. You want to know the real problem? You think technology should be logical, predictable, everything in its proper place with clear rules and no exceptions. He gestured around the command center. But we built this station to survive, not to be logical. When something broke, we fixed it with whatever we had. When we needed more power, we found a way to get it. When systems failed, we made new connections that shouldn't have worked, but did. That's chaos, Nari said. That's adaptation, Day replied. You can build perfect machines for perfect conditions. But when conditions change, when resources run out, when everything goes wrong, your perfect machines break. Our chaos machines keep working. The lights flickered again as another power surge rippled through the station. Through the viewer, they could see the Emperor's ship rocking gently in its unstable dock. Last chance, Yuki said. Fix this now. Day smiled and hefted his wrench. I'll make you a deal. You and your people leave this station. Go back to your ships and disconnect from our power grid. Once you're safely away, I'll stabilize everything. That's surrender. That's reality. You can't control technology you don't understand. And you can't understand technology that was built by people who think problems through differently than you do. Yuki stared at the simple farmer with his dirty clothes and ancient tool. He had single-handedly defeated the technical superiority of the Velkari Empire, using nothing but improvised connections and practical knowledge. Another alarm sounded. This time it was from the Emperor's ship. The power fluctuations had apparently caused some kind of damage to the Imperial vessel's systems. Your Majesty is waiting for an explanation, Day said helpfully. You can tell him that you successfully conquered a human space station, but you can't make it work because you don't understand how we think. Or you can tell him that you withdrew from the station when you realized it was too dangerous to occupy. The crisis began exactly as Day had predicted. At 1400 hours, Commander Huan ordered the station's reactor to be brought to full power in preparation for the Emperor's arrival. Nari, working frantically to eliminate the last of the mysterious malfunctions, complied immediately. For exactly 7 minutes, everything worked perfectly. The reactor hummed at 100% capacity, power flowed smoothly to all sections, and the status board showed green lights across the entire station. Then the first fluctuation hit. Power surge in Section 12, reported Nari's assistant. Voltage is climbing past safe levels. Compensate with the backup regulators, Nari ordered, his fingers flying over the control panel. The backup systems kicked in, automatically reducing power flow to Section 12, but the reduction had to come from somewhere, so the computer rerouted power through secondary lines. Those lines ran through junction points that Day had carefully modified hours earlier. Section 15 is now showing a power deficit, the assistant reported. Gravity generators are dropping below minimum operational parameters. Nari compensated again, pulling power from other systems. Each fix created new problems. Each solution revealed connections that shouldn't have existed. Within 20 minutes, power fluctuations were cascading through the entire station, like water flowing through a broken dam. "This is impossible," Nari muttered, sweat dripping from his forehead as he tried to balance dozens of interconnected systems. "These circuits don't make sense. Why is the artificial gravity connected to the waste processing system? Why does adjusting the reactor output affect the communication array?" Yuki stood behind him, watching the chaos spread across the status displays. Red warning lights were appearing faster than Nari could address them. Nothing was actually breaking yet, but the station was becoming increasingly unstable. "Shut down non-essential systems," she ordered. "Reduce power consumption until we can stabilize the grid." "I'm trying," Nari said, "but I can't tell which systems are essential and which aren't. According to these readings, the food processing unit is somehow critical to maintaining artificial gravity in the command center." Yuki felt anger building in her chest. Human technology defied all logic. How had these primitive creatures ever managed to build anything that worked? She was about to demand answers when a new alarm sounded. This one was different, deeper, and more urgent. "Lieutenant," the communications officer called out, "I'm receiving a distress signal from our ships in the docking bay. They're reporting system failures." "What kind of failures?" "Power fluctuations are affecting their docking clamps. 2 ships have already had to switch to emergency power to avoid being damaged." Yuki stared at the man in disbelief. The power problems on the station were somehow affecting Velkari ships that had their own independent power systems. "It wasn't possible unless—" "The docking bay power umbilicals," she said suddenly, "were connected to their ships through the station's power grid." "Of course," Nari said, looking up from his console with realization dawning on his face. "When we dock, we connect to station power to conserve our own energy reserves. The fluctuations are feeding back through those connections. Disconnect the umbilicals. I can't. They're controlled by the same power grid that's malfunctioning. I'd have to shut down the entire docking bay to break the connection safely." Yuki closed her eyes and tried to think clearly. If they shut down the docking bay, their ships would be trapped until the power problems were resolved. But if they didn't, the fluctuations might damage Velkari vessels. Either choice would be difficult to explain to the Emperor. "How long to fix the power grid?" she asked. "I don't know," Nari admitted. "I can't even understand why it's failing. Every solution I try makes the problem worse." Deep in the agricultural section, Day was monitoring the chaos through a maintenance terminal. The screen showed power distribution data from across the station, and he could see exactly how his modifications were affecting the alien attempts at repair. Every time they tried to stabilize one system, they destabilized 3 others. Every time they thought they had found the root cause, they discovered new connections that led deeper into the maze of human engineering. It was beautiful in its complexity, like watching a symphony of confusion conducted by his grandfather's wrench. But Day wasn't finished yet. The power fluctuations were causing problems, but they weren't enough to force the aliens to abandon the station. He needed something more dramatic, something that would make them realize they were in over their heads. He made his way through familiar tunnels to a junction point near the station's communication array. This was the crown jewel of his plan, a modification he had been saving for the right moment. The communication array was how the aliens coordinated with their fleet and reported to their superiors. It was also connected, through 15 years of emergency repairs and improvised solutions, to half a dozen other systems throughout the station. Day opened the access panel and looked at the maze of cables and circuit boards inside. To an alien engineer, this would look like random chaos, but Day could read the connections like words on a page. This cable carried data from the sensor array. That wire linked to the environmental controls. This circuit board processed signals from the waste management system. It shouldn't have worked. By any reasonable standard of engineering, it was a disaster waiting to happen. But somehow it had worked for years, until now. Day selected 3 specific connections and began working with his wrench. A small adjustment here, a slight modification there. He wasn't breaking anything, just changing the timing of how signals flowed through the system. When he was finished, the communication array would still work perfectly most of the time, but occasionally when specific conditions were met, it would start broadcasting on frequencies that interfered with Velkari ship systems. The interference would be subtle at first. Random static, brief signal drops, minor navigation errors, the kind of problems that could be explained as equipment malfunctions or operator error. But the problems would grow worse over time, especially when the aliens tried to fix them. Because every repair attempt would trigger the modified timing circuits, creating new interference patterns. Day closed the access panel and checked his watch. The Emperor's ship would arrive in 4 hours. By then, the Velkari would be dealing with not just power fluctuations, but communication problems that seemed to multiply every time they tried to solve them. In the command center, Yuki was beginning to understand the true scope of their predicament. The power fluctuations had triggered a cascade of secondary problems throughout the station. Life support systems were cycling on and off randomly. Gravity generators were creating zones of variable gravity that made movement difficult. The computer core was processing data inconsistently, generating false reports and contradictory status updates. "We need to bring in more engineers," Nari said desperately. "I can't handle all these problems alone." "I'll send for technical teams from the fleet," Yuki agreed. "But they won't be familiar with human systems. At this point, I'm not sure anyone is familiar with human systems, including the humans." Yuki was about to respond when Jin was brought into the command center again. The guards had fetched him on Nari's request, hoping that human expertise might help solve the growing crisis. "What's happening to your station?" Nari demanded without preamble. Jin looked at the status displays and tried to hide his satisfaction. The chaos was even worse than he had hoped. Day was exceeding all expectations. "It looks like cascade failure," Jin said carefully. "Sometimes happens when you push the reactor too hard without proper preparation. How do we stop it?" "You have to understand the relationships between systems. Everything on this station is connected to everything else. You can't fix one thing without considering how it affects everything else. Then help us fix it." Jin pretended to consider the request. In truth, he had no intention of helping the aliens solve their problems. But he could appear to help while actually making things worse. "I'll need access to the main engineering console," he said, "and I'll need to see the complete power distribution schematics." Nari quickly granted both requests. Jin sat down at the console and began typing, calling up system after system with the practiced ease of someone who had worked with these controls for years. "Here's one problem," Jin said, pointing to a power flow diagram. "You're trying to route too much power through secondary lines. The system was never designed to handle that load. How do we fix it? Reduce power to non-essential systems. Start with the agricultural section. Those farming systems aren't critical to station operations." Nari immediately began entering commands to reduce power to the agricultural areas. What he didn't know was that the agricultural section had become the control center for Day's entire operation. Reducing power there wouldn't solve the station's problems. It would make them much worse. Jin watched with hidden satisfaction as new alarms began sounding throughout the command center. His apparent attempt to help had just triggered the next phase of Day's plan. In the agricultural section, Day felt the power reduction immediately. The lights dimmed and several of his jury-rigged connections began operating on backup power. But he had planned for this possibility. The first sign of trouble came at dawn. Yuki was reviewing overnight reports when her communication officer suddenly looked up from his console with confusion on his face. "Lieutenant, I'm getting strange readings from the communication array," the officer reported. "Signal strength keeps fluctuating. Sometimes it's normal, sometimes it drops to almost nothing." "Equipment malfunction?" Yuki asked. "I don't think so. The fluctuations follow a pattern. Every time someone adjusts the environmental controls in the agricultural section, our communication strength changes." Yuki frowned. "That makes no sense. Those systems aren't connected." But even as she spoke, she remembered Nari's complaints about the chaotic way humans built their technology. Maybe the systems were connected in ways that defied logic. Can you compensate for it? I'm trying, but the pattern keeps changing. It's like someone is randomly adjusting things down in the farming areas. Yuki made a note to investigate the agricultural section later. For now, she had bigger problems. Commander Juan was expecting a full status report within the hour, and too many systems were still acting strangely. 3 levels below, Day was indeed adjusting things in the farming areas. But it wasn't random at all. He was carefully testing each of his jury-rigged connections, learning exactly how much effect he could create with small changes to the agricultural systems. A slight modification to the air recycling rate would cause static in the aliens' radio communications. Adjusting the water pressure in the irrigation system would trigger false readings in their sensor arrays. Changing the temperature in one growing bay would cause lights to flicker in the docking area. Each connection was small and seemingly harmless. But Day was building something larger. He was turning the entire agricultural section into a control panel for the rest of the station. The best part was that none of the aliens would think to look for sabotage in the farming areas. To them, agriculture was just a support function, beneath the notice of real warriors and engineers. They saw only what they expected to see: primitive human technology malfunctioning in primitive human ways. Day smiled as he fine-tuned a pressure valve that controlled water flow to the tomato plants. The adjustment would also send a surge through the power grid that would cause the alien weapon sensors to report false targets. Not enough to trigger an alert, just enough to keep their technicians busy chasing ghosts. "Make do with what you have," he whispered, echoing his grandfather's words. By midday, the problems had multiplied. Nari was standing in front of a bank of monitors, each one showing a different system malfunction. The list grew longer every hour. Sensor array reports phantom targets in Sector 7, but visual confirmation shows nothing there. He read from his report pad. Gravity generators in sections 12 through 15 are operating at 97% efficiency instead of optimal. Environmental controls in the officer quarters are 2 degrees warmer than settings indicate. Yuki listened to the growing list with increasing irritation. "These are all minor problems. Fix them." "I've tried, Lieutenant, but every time I correct one issue, 2 more appear. It's like the station is actively fighting our repairs." "That's impossible. It's just a machine." "I know it should be impossible, but look at this." Nari brought up a diagnostic display. "This morning I fixed a fluctuation in the communication array. The repair worked perfectly for exactly 43 minutes. Then the problem returned, but in a slightly different form. I fixed it again. 27 minutes later it came back again, but different once more." Yuki studied the display. The pattern was indeed strange, almost like someone was testing their responses and adapting to their countermeasures. Could it be automated? Some kind of self-modifying program? "Humans don't have that level of artificial intelligence," Nari said with certainty. "Their computers are primitive, basic programming at best." "Then what's causing it?" Before Nari could answer, an alarm chimed softly. Another system had developed a minor malfunction. The waste processing unit in Section 9 was running 12% faster than normal settings. Not dangerous, just wrong. Nari sighed and added it to his growing list. In the detention area, Jin was beginning to understand what was happening. The guards had brought him back to his cell after helping with the reactor startup, but they had forgotten to block his access to the internal communication system. Through his cell's emergency terminal, he could monitor basic station operations. What he saw made him smile. Someone was playing games with the Velkari engineers. The malfunctions were too numerous and too perfectly timed to be accidents, but they were also too subtle to trigger major alarms. Whoever was doing this understood the station's systems better than anyone except Day. Jin whispered to himself. It had to be the farmer. Jin remembered him from before the war, a quiet man who worked in the agricultural sections and rarely spoke to anyone outside his department. But Jin had noticed things. Whenever something broke in the farming areas, Day fixed it himself instead of calling for help. He seemed to understand the station's quirks better than the engineers who had designed it. If anyone could have survived the battle and learned to sabotage alien operations, it would be Day. Jin began typing carefully on his terminal. accessing maintenance logs for the agricultural section. He needed to be subtle. If the aliens noticed what he was doing, they would cut off his access immediately. But if he could help Day somehow, maybe they could cause real damage to the occupation force. Meanwhile, Day was preparing for the next phase of his plan. The small malfunctions had served their purpose. They had kept the alien engineers busy and frustrated, preventing them from fully understanding the station's systems. But now it was time to escalate. Day made his way through a service tunnel to a junction point near the main reactor core. This was dangerous territory. Alien guards patrolled the reactor area regularly, and the radiation levels were higher here. But this junction controlled power distribution to the entire station. He opened an access panel and looked at the thick cables that carried power from the reactor to different sections. Each cable was clearly labeled, but the labels meant nothing to someone who didn't understand the station's history. When the station was first built, the power grid had been designed logically. Each section got power through dedicated lines that could be controlled independently. But 15 years of modifications had changed everything. Now power flowed through a maze of backup connections, emergency bypasses, and improvised solutions. Day knew every one of those connections. He had helped install most of them. He selected 3 specific cables and began working with his wrench. A quarter turn here, a slight loosening there. Nothing that would cause immediate problems, but enough to create instabilities that would grow over time. The reactor was running at 70% capacity to power the station's basic systems. When the aliens tried to increase output to full power, these small modifications would cause fluctuations in the power grid. The fluctuations would trigger automatic safety systems. The safety systems would reduce reactor output to compensate. The aliens would think they had a reactor control problem. They would spend hours trying to fix the computer systems that managed reactor operations. They would never think to check for loose connections in the power distribution network. Dave finished his work and closed the access panel. He was about to crawl back through the service tunnel when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He froze, listening carefully. "Check the radiation levels again," a voice said in the alien language. "Command wants hourly reports on reactor status." "Yes, sir." "Readings are normal. No change from the last check." "Good, the Emperor's ship will arrive tomorrow." "Everything must be perfect." Day waited until the voices faded before moving. The Emperor was coming. That changed everything. If the leader of the Velkari Empire was coming to inspect the station, the aliens would want all systems running at maximum efficiency. They would push the reactor to full power. And when they did, Day's modifications would create exactly the kind of cascading failure that had given human engineers nightmares for years. The kind of failure that happened when you tried to fix one thing without understanding how it connected to everything else. Day crawled through the tunnel with renewed energy. He had work to do before the Emperor arrived. Above him, Yuki was receiving her own unwelcome news. A messenger had brought word from Commander Juan's flagship. The Emperor's arrival had been moved up by 6 hours. "I need full system reports from all departments," Yuki ordered. "The Emperor must see that we have complete control of this station." "Lieutenant," Nari said hesitantly, "we still have those minor malfunctions throughout the station." "Nothing dangerous, but fix them. All of them. We have 18 hours. Nari looked at his long list of problems and felt his confidence drain away. 18 hours to solve issues that had been getting worse all day. It would take a miracle, or it would take understanding systems that seemed designed by madmen. He returned to his console and began working faster, not knowing that each fix he attempted would soon make the real problems much worse. 2 hours after the lights came back on in Agricultural Bay 7, Day was elbow-deep in a water recycling unit when he heard voices in the corridor outside. He froze, listening carefully. The words were in the alien language, but the tone was clear enough. They were arguing. Day quietly closed the access panel and crept to the door. Through a crack in the metal, he could see 2 Velkari soldiers standing near the entrance to the bay. One was tall and thin with dark blue skin. The other was shorter and stockier with lighter coloring. "This section was supposed to be dead," the tall one was saying in broken human language. "No power. No life support. But look," he pointed at the lights glowing along the corridor walls. "Maybe backup power," the shorter alien suggested. "Humans are too stupid to build proper systems. Everything breaks when you touch it. No, look at the air recycling unit. It's running at full capacity, and the temperature is normal. This whole section should be freezing by now." Day pressed closer to the crack in the door. The aliens were standing right next to the recycling unit he had just finished repairing. It was running perfectly now, cleaning the air and maintaining proper temperature for the entire agricultural section. Should we report this? The shorter alien asked. Report what? That human machines are more broken than we thought? Lieutenant Yuki has better things to worry about. The tall alien kicked the recycling unit with his boot. Stupid human technology. Probably has some kind of automatic backup system that we haven't found yet. They moved on down the corridor, still complaining about human engineering. Day waited until their voices faded before coming out of hiding. He smiled to himself. The aliens thought his repairs were just more human stupidity. Perfect. Day had been working steadily for hours, moving from one system to another throughout the agricultural section. He had restored power to 3 more growing bays, fixed the main water circulation pump, and repaired the atmospheric processors that kept the air breathable. The work was slow and careful. Each repair had to look accidental, like a system that had fixed itself. More importantly, each repair gave him access to other parts of the station's infrastructure. The agricultural section was connected to everything else through maintenance tunnels, service pipes, and utility conduits. When the original builders had designed the station, they had planned for the farming areas to be completely separate from military systems. But 15 years of repairs, modifications, and emergency fixes had created connections everywhere. Day knew them all. He had crawled through every tunnel, traced every pipe, and fixed every broken connection. While the soldiers fought their war above, he had built his own map of the station's hidden pathways. Now he was going to use that knowledge. Day made his way through a narrow service tunnel that ran behind the main corridor walls. After 20 minutes of crawling, he reached a junction point where 6 different systems came together. Power cables, water pipes, air ducts, and data lines all passed through this one small space. He pulled out his flashlight and examined the connections carefully. Here was a power line that ran to the station's communication array. There was a data cable that connected to the main computer core, and this thick pipe carried pressurized air to the docking bays where the alien ships were attached. Day opened his tool bag and got to work. Meanwhile, in the command center, Yuki was getting more frustrated by the minute. Her engineers had been trying to restart the station's main reactor for 3 hours. It should have been simple. Velkari technology could interface with any power system in the known galaxy, but human systems seem to follow no logical rules at all. The control circuits are completely scrambled, Nari reported, wiping sweat from his forehead. Every time I think I understand the layout, I find another connection that shouldn't exist. Explain, Yuki demanded. Look at this. Nari pointed to a diagram on his screen. The reactor's primary control system is connected to the environmental controls. The environmental controls are connected to the communication array. The communication array is connected to the waste processing system, and the waste processing system connects back to the reactor controls. Yuki stared at the diagram. That makes no sense. Why would they design it that way? They didn't design it. They just kept adding pieces whenever something broke. It's like building a house by nailing random boards wherever you need them. But it worked for them? Somehow, yes. But I can't figure out how. Every time I try to start the reactor using proper procedures, the system shuts down. It's like the reactor won't start unless all these other systems are running too. Yuki felt a headache building behind her eyes. The Emperor would arrive soon to inspect their victory. He would expect to see the station fully operational and ready to serve as a forward base. Instead, they couldn't even turn on the lights in most sections. Keep trying, she ordered. Use the human prisoners if you have to. Someone must understand how this mess works. Nari nodded reluctantly and returned to his console. He hated asking primitive species for help, but he was running out of options. In the detention area, Jin sat on a hard metal bench and tried not to think about how many of his friends were dead. He had been the station's chief engineer before the attack. Now he was just another prisoner waiting to find out what the aliens planned to do with him. The door to his cell opened, and a Velkari soldier gestured for him to come out. Jin followed without resisting. There was no point in fighting anymore. They brought him to the command center where Nari was standing in front of a wall display covered with circuit diagrams. The alien engineer looked angry and tired. You will explain how your reactor works, Nari said without introduction. Jin looked at the diagrams on the screen. They were covered with notes in the Velkari language, but he could see what they were trying to do. They wanted to restart the main reactor using standard procedures. It would never work. You can't start it that way, Jin said quietly. What do you mean? The reactor isn't just a power source. It's part of a network. You have to bring up the environmental systems first, then the computer core, then the secondary generators. Only then can you start the main reactor. Nari made a disgusted sound. That's completely backwards. The reactor should provide power to other systems, not depend on them. I know it seems wrong, Jin said, but that's how we built it. We didn't have enough resources to do everything the right way. We had to make compromises. Show me. Jin moved to the control panel and began entering commands. His fingers moved quickly over the human interface, calling up system after system in careful sequence. Within minutes, he had brought the environmental controls online throughout most of the station. Now the computer core, Jin said, typing more commands. It has to sync with the environmental data before we can access the reactor controls. Lights began coming on throughout the command center. The main display screens flickered to life, showing status reports from all over the station. Nari watched with amazement as the chaotic human systems slowly came online in perfect coordination. How did you know to do that? Nari asked. Experience, Jin said. I've been working with these systems for 10 years. You learn the quirks. But even as he spoke, Jin was frowning at one of the status displays. According to the computer, the agricultural section was running at full power. All systems were green. That was impossible. The agricultural section had been shut down when they lost main power hours ago, unless someone had manually restarted every system down there. Someone who knew the station as well as Jin did. Someone who was still free. Jin smiled for the first time since the battle ended. Maybe the war wasn't over after all. Deep in the station's lower levels, Day finished connecting the last wire in his improvised modification. He had spent 2 hours carefully rerouting control signals from the agricultural section to other parts of the station. Now, whenever someone tried to adjust the air recycling in the farming bays, they would also be sending commands to the communication array. When they tested the water pumps, they would be activating sensors in the docking bay. It was the kind of jury-rigged connection that would drive a proper engineer insane. It was also completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Day closed the access panel and checked his watch. Soon the aliens would try to restart more of the station's systems. When they did, his little modifications would start causing problems. Small ones at first, easy to ignore or explain away. But problems had a way of growing when you didn't understand the system you were working with. Day picked up his grandfather's wrench and headed for the next junction point. He had a lot more connections to make before dawn. The lights flickered one last time before dying completely. Commander Juan of the Velkari 3rd Fleet watched the human defense station go dark through his ship's main viewer. Smoke drifted from broken sections of the massive structure that had once protected the planet below. After 3 days of fighting, the battle was finally over. Report, Juan said to his lieutenant Yuki, who stood at the control panel beside him. All human resistance has stopped. Commander, Yuki replied, her blue skin glowing slightly in the dim light of the bridge. Our troops have taken control of all major sections. The humans fought hard, but their weapons were too weak. Juan nodded with satisfaction. The humans had surprised everyone with their determination. Most species surrendered quickly when faced with Velkari power, but these creatures had fought for every room, every corridor. It didn't matter now. They were beaten. What about their leaders? Juan asked. Dead or captured, Yuki said, checking her datapad. We found their command center 2 hours ago. The station's main computer is shut down. Their reactor is cold. They have no power, no weapons, no hope. Through the viewer, Juan could see Velkari assault ships moving around the station like metal insects. They carried troops to secure the remaining sections and engineers to study human technology. The station was huge with thousands of rooms and corridors. It would take time to search everything, but they had won. That was what mattered. The humans built this station well, Juan admitted. It's crude compared to our ships, but strong. We can use it as a base to control their planet. Yuki looked at her datapad again. Sir, our engineers are having trouble with some of their systems. The humans built things in a strange way. Nothing follows proper design rules. What do you mean? Their power grid makes no sense. Pipes and wires go everywhere. Some systems connect to others that shouldn't be related. It's like they just added pieces whenever they needed them without any plan. Juan laughed. That's why they lost, Lieutenant. No discipline, no proper thinking. We will fix their mistakes and make this station work correctly. Deep inside the station, far from the fighting and the victory celebrations, Day crouched in a maintenance tunnel barely wide enough for his shoulders. He pressed his ear to the metal wall and listened to boots marching past in the corridor beyond. The alien voices were strange, with clicking sounds he couldn't understand. Day was not a soldier. He was a farmer. For 2 years he had grown food in the station's agricultural bays while others fought the war. He knew how to make plants grow in space, how to fix irrigation pumps, and how to keep the air clean in the growing chambers. He had never held a weapon except to hunt rats that got into the grain stores. When the attack began 3 days ago, Day had been working in the lower agricultural section. The fighting never reached that far down. Most people forgot the farming areas even existed. The soldiers thought about weapons and shields and tactics. They didn't think about who grew their food or fixed their toilets. Now Day was probably the only human left free on the station. He had heard the surrender announcement on his radio before the power died. Captain Park was dead. Major Kim was captured. The reactor was shut down. The war was over, but Day couldn't surrender. Not yet. He had work to do. He crawled through the tunnel toward the agricultural section, pulling himself forward with his elbows. In his right hand, he clutched his grandfather's wrench. It was old and heavy, made of real steel instead of the light metals they use now. His grandfather had used it to fix farm equipment back on Earth. His father had carried it when the family moved to the colonies. Now it was Day's turn. The tunnel opened into a small service room filled with pipes and electrical boxes. Day squeezed out and stood up, stretching his aching muscles. He had been hiding for hours, moving carefully through the forgotten spaces between walls. He opened a maintenance door and stepped into Agricultural Bay 7. The lights were off, but emergency power still glowed in thin strips along the floor. Rows of growing tanks stretched out in the darkness, filled with vegetables and grains that would never be harvested now. Day walked between the tanks, checking each one with practiced eyes. The plants were already starting to wilt without proper lighting. The water pumps had stopped working when the main power died. Everything he had built here was dying, but that wasn't what worried him most. Day pulled out a small flashlight and walked to the environmental control panel on the far wall. The screen was dark, but he didn't need it to see the problem. He could feel it in the air. The station's life support system was failing. Without power from the main reactor, the backup systems were slowly running down. Air recycling was operating at minimum levels. Heating was off completely. In 6 hours, maybe 8, the air would become too thin to breathe. The temperature would drop below freezing. Everyone on the station would die. Humans and aliens alike. Day opened the panel and looked at the circuits inside. He had worked with these systems for 2 years. He knew every wire, every connection, every shortcut the original builders had made. The station's designers had built it to last, but they had also built it cheap. When something broke, they fixed it with whatever was available. When they needed more power, they ran new cables wherever they would fit. It was a mess by engineering standards. But Day understood it perfectly. He pulled out his wrench and got to work. Above him, in the station's command center, Yuki was trying to make sense of the human computer systems. Her engineering team had been working for hours, but nothing was going the way it should. "This is impossible," complained Nari, the lead engineer. "Their computer speaks 12 different programming languages. Their database has no logical structure. How did they make any of this work?" "Humans are not logical," Yuki said. "Everyone knows this. Just force the system to work properly. I've tried, Lieutenant, but every time I fix one problem, 3 more appear. Their security system thinks the environmental controls are weapons. Their weapons system is somehow connected to their food storage. Nothing makes sense," Yuki frowned. The Velkari were master engineers. They had conquered 47 worlds, and their technology had never failed to adapt to local systems. But human technology seemed designed by madmen. "Keep working," she ordered. "We need to understand their systems before the Emperor arrives." Nari bent over his console again, muttering complaints about primitive human logic. Meanwhile, in the lower levels of the station, Day had opened an access panel in the main corridor of Agricultural Bay 7. Inside was a junction box that connected the bay's power systems to the rest of the station. It wasn't supposed to be there according to the original plans, but 5 years ago, when they needed emergency power for the growing lights, someone had run a cable directly from the station's backup generator grid. It was exactly the kind of improvised solution that would drive alien engineers crazy. It was also exactly what Day needed. He began disconnecting cables, sorting them by size and function. His grandfather's wrench was the perfect tool for the job. It could grip any size bolt, apply just the right amount of pressure, and reach into tight spaces that newer tools couldn't manage. As he worked, Day thought about his grandfather's farm back on Earth. The old man had grown rice in fields that flooded every spring and froze every winter. When the tractors broke down, he fixed them with spare parts from 3 different machines. When the power failed, he rigged generators from old car engines. Make do with what you have, his grandfather always said. Smart men complain about problems. Wise men solve them. Day smiled as he stripped the insulation from a power cable. The aliens might have better technology, but they had never learned to make do. They had never learned to solve problems with nothing but determination and a good wrench. The lights in the corridor flickered once, then came on steady and bright. Day nodded with satisfaction and moved to the next junction box. He had a lot more work to do.